The air in my lungs felt different the moment I stepped from the gravel of the parking lot onto the dirt of the trail. It was thick, rich with the scent of damp earth, pine needles, and something else, something ancient and wild. For years, I had lived a life measured in right angles and scheduled intervals. My world was one of concrete, glass, and the persistent low hum of electronics. The forest was an escape, a challenge I had only read about in books and watched in documentaries. Now I was finally here, alone, with a brand new pack on my back and a map in my pocket that felt as foreign as a page from a dead language. The first few hours were pure bliss. The trail was a gentle, winding guide, and the forest canopy filtered the sunlight into a dappled, shifting mosaic on the ground. I felt a giddy sense of freedom with every step. This was it. This was real. I was a modern-day explorer, a man shedding the skin of a predictable life to commune with nature. I named the birds I saw, pointed out different types of trees to myself, as if I were a seasoned botanist, and felt an almost comical surge of pride when I successfully navigated my first stream crossing. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing that the map promised would be there. I set up my tent with the slow, deliberate movements of someone following written instructions. It wasn't elegant, but it stood. As I sat by my small camp stove, watching water slowly come to a boil, a profound silence began to settle around me. It wasn't the absence of noise, it was the absence of human noise. The wind whispered through the high branches, a squirrel chittered angrily from a nearby tree, but beneath it all was a quiet so deep it felt like a physical presence. For the first time, a sliver of unease pierced my confidence. The solitude I had craved now felt absolute. That night, sleep was a restless, shallow affair. Every snap of a twig was a predator, every hoot of an owl a warning. The thin nylon of my tent felt like a paper-thin barrier against a vast, indifferent wilderness. I woke with the first gray light of dawn, stiff and unrefreshed, but the morning sun burned away my nocturnal fears. I was determined to push deeper. My plan for the day was ambitious, a hike to a small, unnamed lake nestled high in a basin off the main trail. It was a challenge I'd set for myself, a way to prove I was more than just a weekend warrior. Leaving the marked path felt like stepping off a cliff. The instant, the forest became a different entity. The ground was uneven, covered in a tangle of roots and rocks. The easy rhythm of trail walking was replaced by a constant, calculating process of choosing each footstep. An hour in, I realized I hadn't consulted my compass in a while. I pulled it out, my heart giving a little flutter. I was sure of my general direction, but when I looked at the needle, it didn't quite align with the mental map I had been building. A touch of arrogance made me trust my gut over the instrument. The compass, I reasoned, must be affected by some local mineral deposit. I pushed on. The sky, which had been a brilliant cloudless blue, began to haze over. The temperature dropped. A light drizzle began to fall, not enough to soak me, but enough to make the rocks slick and the air clammy. The landscape, which had seemed so distinct, began to blur into a monotonous sea of green and gray. The confidence I had felt just hours before was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. I stopped and pulled out my map and compass again. This time I forced myself to believe them. According to the map, the lake should be to my northwest. According to my gut, it was straight ahead. I had been walking for nearly 3 hours. My gut had to be right. It wasn't. Another hour of struggling through dense undergrowth led me not to a lake, but to the edge of a steep, rocky gorge I couldn't possibly cross. It wasn't on my map. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I was lost. The word itself felt like a physical blow. I was a cliché, another overconfident fool swallowed by the wilderness.
I spent the next few hours in a state of controlled fear, trying to backtrack, but my own trail had been washed away by the persistent rain. Every direction looked the same. The majestic forest now felt like a prison, its towering trees the bars of a cage. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was menacing. It was the sound of a world that did not know I existed and would not care if I ceased to exist. As dusk began to bleed into the gray afternoon, I was on the verge of giving in to despair. I was tired, soaked, and hopelessly, terrifyingly lost. I decided to find a spot to make a crude shelter for the night and hope for a miracle in the morning. As I scanned the area, looking for a rock overhang or a dense cluster of pines, I heard it.
It was faint, almost lost in the sound of the wind and dripping water. A rhythmic tap, tap, tap. My first thought was a woodpecker, but the sound was too metallic, too consistent. Tap, tap, tap. It stopped, then started again. My blood ran cold. Every horror story I had ever heard flooded my mind. Was someone out here? Was I being watched? Stalked? The sound was unnatural, and in this place, the unnatural was terrifying. I stood frozen for a long minute, listening. There it was again. Tap, tap, tap. It was weak, but it was deliberate. It wasn't the sound of a threat. It was the sound of a signal. A new feeling pushed through the panic. Responsibility. Someone else might be in trouble. My own predicament, as dire as it was, suddenly felt secondary. With a new sense of purpose, I began moving toward the sound. It was slow going. I'd stop, listen, correct my course, and move again. The tapping would fade, and my heart would sink, only for it to return a moment later, a faint beacon in the growing gloom. It led me to a part of the forest even wilder than what I had been through, a chaotic jumble of moss-covered boulders and fallen trees. And there, wedged in a narrow crevice between two massive rocks, I saw it, a flash of bright blue fabric. I scrambled closer, my heart pounding. A person was lying in the crevice, their leg bent at an unnatural angle. They were pale and shivering, but their eyes were open. In their hand, they held a small camping knife, which they were weakly tapping against a metal water bottle. Tap, tap, tap. They had been off trail just like me, and had slipped, falling into the crevice and breaking their leg. Their pack, with all their supplies, was just out of reach. They had been lying there for over a day, calling out until their voice was gone, finally resorting to the faint hope that someone might hear the tapping. In that instant, I was no longer a lost man. I was a rescuer. The fear for my own life was replaced by a fierce protective focus. I talked to them, my voice steady, reassuring both of us. I used the rope from my pack to retrieve their gear. I splinted their leg using 2 sturdy branches and strips of cloth cut from my spare shirt, just like I had seen in a book. I got my stove going and made them a hot, sugary drink. I covered them with my emergency blanket, the crinkling of the foil, a sound of hope. I couldn't move them, and night was falling fast. I made a decision. I would make them as comfortable as possible, and at first light, I would hike out for help. But this time, I wouldn't be guessing. I took out my map and compass. I looked at the terrain, at the position of the setting sun. I took a bearing. I would not get lost again. I had to get out. For them. I left them with most of my food and water. Leaving them alone was the hardest thing I ever did. But as I looked back, they gave me a weak, grateful nod. That nod was all the fuel I needed. The hike out the next morning was a grueling, relentless push. I didn't think about being tired. I didn't think about being scared. I thought about the map. I thought about the compass. I thought about the steady, rhythmic tapping that had saved both of our lives. Every step was precise, deliberate. The forest was no longer my enemy. It was a challenge to be navigated, a problem to be solved. When I finally stumbled onto the marked trail I had left so arrogantly the day before, I almost collapsed with relief. A few hours later, I reached the trailhead and found help. I led the rescue team back in, not faltering once, finding the exact spot. Later, sitting in the ranger's office, wrapped in a blanket and sipping hot coffee, I learned that the other hiker was going to be okay. They told me I had saved their life. But the truth is, I think we saved each other. I went into the forest looking for solitude, to test myself against the wild. I thought the challenge was about me versus nature. I was wrong. I got lost, I was terrified, and I failed my own selfish test. But in failing, I found something better. I found a purpose. I learned that the skills you pack in your head, the knowledge, the calm, the resolve, are far more important than the gear on your back. I still go to the forest. I go more often now. I've learned to read a map properly, to trust my compass, and to respect the weather. I'm no longer a tourist seeking a thrill. I'm a visitor paying my respects. The wild is not a thing to be conquered. It's a place that can strip you down to your essential self, and sometimes, in the deepest, most frightening silence, it can show you not only what you're made of, but what you're capable of doing for someone else. And that is a discovery worth getting a little lost for.